Welcome back to Passionate World Talk Radio Network, a wholly owned subsidiary of Global Media Network LLC. Educate, enlighten, entertain, and let's not forget mindfulness. On today's episode of Lest We Forget with Lillian Cauldwell, we are taking an opinion piece from Hippo Rees. And the title is Trumping the Executive Branch, a brief history of presidential overreach and the failure of checks and balances. And it's written by Cameron, Cameron Espinoza, Espinoza. The summary Cameron provides is, although serious scrutiny of President Trump's action is warranted, we must not over and individualize them. Many U.S. presidents have engaged in similar dubious and reprehensible acts, made impossible promises, silenced the media, and lied outright in order to achieve their domestic and foreign policy goals. As such, we must examine the very institutions that fail to hold presidents accountable and responsible for their actions. So we know that the current administration is not the only administration who's overreaching their executive powers. Apparently, U.S. American presidents have a long history of deception, coercion, outright lying, using covert action, defying Congress, or exceeding their constitutional mandates to achieve their domestic and foreign policy goals, particularly in the 1970s, when legislation such as the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was passed. This increased Congress's authority, and consequently, congressional staffs rose by over 400%. Meanwhile, public trust waned, especially in the Nixon years. As a result, Congress is a greater position to examine and formulate policy. With the advent of the internet, the American public has gained the ability to access a backlog of statements by politicians instantaneously, as well as information from thousands of news outlets. The creation of the civil rights movement and of the United Farm Workers are examples of civic actions which translated into legislations. So this illustrates the historical baseline which the American public has had as a check against the executive. There are, however, more examples of presidential overreach and acquiescence on the part of Congress and sometimes of the American public. In 1964, the Tolkien Resolution was passed under Lyndon B. Johnson, which was based on dubious intelligence describing a phantom sea battle between the USS Maddox and a North Vietnamese torpedo boat. The resolution granted Johnson extensive war powers and significantly expanded the scope of the Vietnam War. Ironically, Johnson spent much of 1964 campaigning on a peace platform. In his speeches, Johnson repeatedly told the American public, quote, "Some others are eager to enlarge the conflict. However, we are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing themselves. We don't want to get tied down to a land war in Asia." So vote for Johnson was a vote for the de-escalation of the Vietnam complex. Yet 1 year later, 3,500 American troops were sent to Vietnam. The number of troops Johnson sent to Asia would eventually exceed 500,000. At the time, the 1964 resolution didn't have a lot of scrutiny on the part of the legislative branch. The House voted unanimously on the resolution, with only 2 dissenting votes, which emerged from the Senate. Johnson went on to say that the resolution, because of the broad scope of the powers it granted the executive, was like grandmother's nightshirt. It covers everything. Then came the Iran-Contra affair, represented by President Ronald Reagan's most notable act of deception. In 1982, Reagan sold weapons to Iran in exchange for hard cash and the liberation of American hostages in Tehran. He used the money from the arms sales to fund the anti-government right-wing militias known as the Contras in Nicaragua, thereby advancing his commitment to containment involving neither military intervention nor significant military budget increase. In doing so, the administration bypassed Operation Staunch, which banned U.S. arms shipments to Iran, and Congress by orchestrating a money transfer between Israel and Stanford Technology Group's international Swiss bank account, while exploiting loopholes in Bolin 1 and 2 legislation passed by Congress to restrict funding for the Contras. Furthermore, this contradiction the administration's message to the American public. Just days before the deal with Iran, Reagan stated, quote, "The United States gives Iranian terrorists no rewards. We make no concessions. We make no deals," end quote. The way in which Reagan administration went about gaining support for the Contras was equally dubious. In 1983, he created an institutionalized propaganda department under the National Security Decision Directive. This organization leaked favorable selective information to news outlets and staged, quote, over 80 publicity stunts to influence public and congressional opinion before upcoming Contras and votes, unquote. Reagan initially denied any knowledge of the affair, though he did eventually admit to violating Bolin 1 and 2. Congress absolved him of deliberately lying to the American people despite evidence to the contrary. The few that received a conviction for their involvement, yes, they were pardoned by George H.W. Bush. His son, George W. Bush, also practiced deception through fear-mongering and outright lies to Congress, to the American public, and to foreign governments when he vastly exaggerated the threat posed by Saddam Hussein by claiming that the Iraq president had weapons of mass destruction in his possession. Despite thin and unreliable evidence, lack of international support, and skepticism in Congress, Bush was able to obtain congressional approval for the 2002 National Security Strategy by deliberately timing the debate before midterm elections. The Bush government recognized that, quote, it was risky for members of Congress, especially those who were in tight re-election races, to oppose his administration on an issue of national security. The reason why these presidents felt they could not openly and honestly pursue their foreign policies vary. However, in each of the aforementioned cases, the presidents lacked full congressional support, and they felt they were preserving national security and were driven by a sense of immediacy and necessity. Motivation for these types of acts include the preservation of international order, the upholding of American credibility, perceived aggression, institutional constraints, and the experience of recent conflicts. In 1973, Congress did pass the War Powers Act to stop future Vietnams, although the conflict there was ongoing. But presidents have since largely ignored this check on their power. Furthermore, instead of challenging the president, Congress has used its extended powers for grandstanding and feigning activism in times of crisis. Congress has tended to submit to the president for fear of looking weak in the following election. Opinion. So when the atomic bomb is dropped on the U.S. from Iran because our current administration threatened them with bombing them, remember that quote. The Congress was afraid of the president and looking weak in the following election, which are midterms. These actions, as well as increasing campaign promises and bleak pictures of domestic and international affairs, have contributed to deep-seated cynicism among the American public. Think about our current administration's grim portrayal of the United States and its simple promises to resolve the issues of the day, solving our immigration issues with Central America and Mexico by building a wall. However, he's not the only one. JFK, in his 1960 presidential campaign, terrified the American public by speaking of a security gap in order to boost his election bid. And Ronald Reagan argued, much to the chagrin of Henry Kissinger, that under President Ford, the United States had become number 2. Furthermore, these presidents ran on a platform of unattainable ideals, facial solutions, and nonspecific policy promises rather than pragmatism. He goes on to say that he has pointed to several well-known examples in history only to demonstrate the fact that American presidents have a tendency to present, quote, the American public with a simple-minded, cost-free view of the world, that they often disappoint the American public early on. And this is also illustrated by the fact that outsider candidates, Carter, Reagan, Clinton, Bush II, Obama, and the current administration, run as anti-presidents and have had such success in the past 50 years. But perhaps also more troubling for us is the harsh rhetoric or the implausible promises without explanation that our current administration uses. George W. Bush, in an interview with Mike Wallace, stated, quote, I do not need to explain why I say things. That's the interesting thing about being president. Maybe someone needs to explain to me why they say something, but I don't feel like I owe anybody an explanation. Richard Nixon said, if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. In his infamous 1977 interview with David Frost. What we need to examine are not the lies per se, but the persistence of saying these lies. How can Americans not be expected to grow disillusioned when a president promised them without any explanation to, quote, make America great again, and then ask them to bear all of the burdens of the world, or announces his intention to bring about democracy everywhere? How can they not lose faith in a Congress which acts purely in a spirit of opposition, contradiction, and negativity, and which is increasingly accountable to the economic elite, and which uses its powers for phony activism? When one reviews the history of American foreign policy, it seems that the current administration engages in covert acts, uses deception, or drives the press into quietude. He would be acting in ways entirely consistent with those of his predecessors. We should not merely write articles showing that the current administration is a liar. In fact, we should not fall into the same moralizing trap as politicians by arguing it is always impermissible to lie. There are times when presidents need to use covert action or to bypass the beleaguered constraints of the executive office. Rather, we must examine why the United States has a political system which rewards promisers rather than realists and blanket doctrinaires rather than pragmatists who offer dual solutions to domestic problems. We must try to find ways by which Congress can hold the executive branch accountable without compromising national security. The questions we need to be asking ourselves should revolve around the realm of realism and politics. For example, why do we, and that's the American public, not have realistic expectation or ideas about our political leaders to do or ought to do? Why must political leaders have dogmatic policy goals which discourage practical compromise in order to get elected? Why do presidents often feel it is necessary to lie in order to realize their goals? Incidentally, this is a ripple effect to your children because they'll think it means that, well, if the president can lie, so can I. Think about that, parents. Why does Congress let them get away with untruths? Why does the House use its expanded powers for showboating rather than challenging and checking executive authority? Why are Americans, not just old, white, cynical men, so cynical about their political institution? Is it because of the impossible promises in which political leaders must trap themselves to get elected? Does this explain why American voters tend to flock towards change or anti-president candidates? What specific institutions and mechanisms have increased the public cynicism and encouraged such political dogmatism? Scholars, some of them, have suggested reconstructing the National Security Council, making realistic campaign promises, and increasing community leadership, extending congressional term limits, campaign finance reform, abolishing the Electoral College is one such effort. The greater public understanding and control of the international monetary system, independent commissions for redistricting and ranked choice voting, and civic education are solutions which have been proposed to strengthen democratic institutions and accountability. However, the legacy of American politicians and political institutions are waning. Media outlets must bring attention to specific institutions and behaviors which undermine American democracy rather than singling out the current administration. For in many ways, the current administration is a caricature of a failed political system. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. If you're very interested in what I'm saying, you can read the entire article in Hobbes Read, and the URL is provided in the blog. So go over to passionateworldtalkradio.com/blog, and you can go and check out the article yourself. You can also see this video and hear the audio over again by going over to passionateworldtalkradio.com/blog, where the audio is posted, or scroll down to State of Current Affairs, click on it takes you to a page where a Google link is. Click on to the Google link and it'll take you into the belly of the beast, YouTube. You can also be invited to come over to passionworldtalkradio.com and have us help you with conscious research solutions, where if you don't know where to start, how to do research, how to find the research you need, and more importantly, how to use the research you find, we can help you. Go over to passionworldtalkradio.com/research made simple and scroll down. You are offered a free 15-minute consultation where we can answer all your questions about helping you with your research and also what we can do for you. On our blog, Research Made Simple blog, we provide you pain points and resolutions to help you not have them. And if you need any help, in addition, whether it's business, personal, or spiritual, check out AI with Lillian. It will take you over to the webpage of ruby.ai, read the testimonials, see how it works, and then sign up for a monthly subscription. It is not going to go away, artificial intelligence. Your children are going to grow up with it in the form of robots. Thank you very much for listening. And if you really enjoy special reports, lest we forget, chatting with Betsy, political and sports commentaries with Dan Riley, please donate. passionworldtalkradio.com/donate. And let's keep this all women run and operational internet talk station alive for the next millennia. Thank you and have a great weekend.